So hi everyone, and thank you for having me. I hope everyone is doing well. So this talk's all about the Mediator library. So this is a small open source .NET library by Jimmy Bogart, and you've probably heard of him through Automapper, which is another popular open source project he's created. Before I start talking about Mediator, though, a very quick introduction to myself. So I run another fellow user group called .NET Oxford, which is how a lot of you might already know me. If you go to .NEToxford.com, that's got the link to our meetup and Slack and all the past meetup notes from the past 4 years. I'm a contractor, so I specialize in .NET and Azure as well as full stack stuff. So I do React, Angular, Vue stuff as well, and databases, basic full stack stuff. Everstack's my limited company, which I put all my contract work through. I've also recently started a podcast, which is quite exciting and nerve-wracking too. This is called the Unhandled Exception Podcast, and this should be available on all major podcast apps. Interestingly enough, Cliff mentioned Pete Gallagher quite a few times, and we just did a recording. So this was published a few days ago on teaching kids to code. So yeah, so we spoke for over an hour about lots of microbit and like block-based programming. So that was quite an interesting conversation. But if you do listen to the podcast and you enjoy it, please do help me out by just sharing on social media and rating in your favorite podcast app. It just helps me spread the word a bit. I've also got a blog, danclarke.com, and all my links to all my stuff is on there. So like Twitter, LinkedIn, the podcast, everything's on there. If you want to reach out to me, the best place is probably Twitter. My DMs are open, so that's but anywhere really. So Mediator is available on this URL, and it's open source. It's got really good documentation. So the term Mediator. So if you Google for this term, and the key word here really is like go between. So it's kind of like a person in the middle. Ignore this conflict word. We can like scratch that out for what our definition. It's basically a person in the middle, which a go-between, effectively. And the idea of the Mediator library is that it kind of helps enforce some best practices. So things like separation of concern, single responsibility principle. So you can have, and we'll see this very shortly, but even though you don't need Mediator to do these things, you can use dependency inversion, interfaces. Mediator kind of like just helps enforce that pattern. So it's all about like just enforcing patterns. So for a real world example, the stakeholder might pass in project requirements, and then the project manager would then delegate to like a team of developers. So they might delegate the requirement to one developer or more than one developer. And one of the key points is that the developers don't know about the stakeholder, and the stakeholder don't know about the developers. It's all going through the mediator, the project manager. Now, obviously, this is quite an old-fashioned development team, but it works for this example. So taking this example into the context of Mediator, Mediator is the library, the Mediator library. Now, I've got ASP.NET Core here. You don't have to use, but Mediator doesn't have to just be used on ASP.NET Core projects. But in this example, that's commonly where I use it. In the demos we're doing, we're going to use ASP.NET Core. So if this is an ASP.NET Core Web API endpoint, for example, and that can pass a request to the Mediator library, which can then pass. So we've got a concept of handlers, which we'll talk about in a sec. So this is your business logic, and this can then pass that request onto the handler, which can then pass a response back. The idea is that these handlers don't have any knowledge of ASP.NET Core. It doesn't know what ASP.NET is. Your business logic doesn't know what ASP.NET is, and vice versa as well. So this really comes into the separation of concerns. So just to show this, let's just jump over to Rider. I was planning on creating a new project from scratch for this, but I timed it and I could not do it in 20 minutes. So basically, here's one I made earlier. If we zoom in a bit here, we can see that if we ignore controllers, I've created some, these are mediator terms, behavior, handlers, and requests. Now, you might not structure your project like this. If you're a fan of feature folders, you might have a folder for a feature and put all the behaviors, handlers, and requests and models and controllers and whatever in the same folder. So I'm not saying you should lay out your project like this. This is just for this demo, because we're explaining mediator concepts. This was a nice way of laying it out. So if you're not used to Rider, Rider's got like obviously a NuGet package manager, the same as Visual Studio. And if we search for Mediator here, then so search for Mediator, and we've got a couple of results here. This one, Mediator, is like the main Mediator NuGet package. But this is the one we're going to use because that adds dependency injection and an extension method to help us set this up really easily. So first thing, once we've installed those NuGet packages, the first thing we need to do is, so if you're not familiar with ASP.NET, Startup is kind of where you configure your web API or your website. And to set up Mediator, we literally just call that. So this is an extension method which was added as part of the NuGet package. And because Mediator uses reflection, we just need to specify a type that's in the assembly with these behaviors and handlers and things. And that's it. That's all you need to do to actually register Mediator. Then the next thing is the handler. So the handler is kind of where you put your business logic. So we've got a really, really simple piece of business logic, which is just concatenating a string. So it's saying hello and then a name that comes from the request here. So a few points to mention about this is it implements iRequestHandler, which is a Mediator interface, and that enforces you to implement this method, or not that one, this method called handle. And so there's one entry point. So this single responsibility thing, obviously this method could be really long and not adhere to the single responsibility principle, but just having one public method that gets called by Mediator kind of like helps out with having just one responsibility. And when we start talking about behaviors and pipelines, then that really helps us separate out these different responsibilities. So if we go to the controller now, so if you're not familiar with Web API or ASP.NET, the controller is the class, and methods that look like this are called actions, and these are effectively an API endpoint, the entry point into the API. And because if we go back to here, if you remember that ASP.NET Core only knows about Mediator, so it doesn't have a concept of the business logic, it just needs to know about Mediator. So all we need to do is inject in iMediator, because that's all this needs to know about. And iMediator is obviously part of that library we saw before. And ignore this publish, this commented out line. We'll look at this in a bit. But all we need to do is call this method send, which we're basically sending a request to Mediator. And in this case, we're passing, if you remember, that the business logic took in a name from the request. So we're just giving it a name, .NET Southwest. And also, we've got this request here as well. So if we look at this next, the request that we're sending to Mediator. My request is, again, so a lot of Mediator stuff follows this pattern where you just implement a type in an interface in Mediator. So iRequest, we're implementing iRequest. This generic here is optional, but this specifies the response type. Whereas where I've got a string here, this could be This could be a DTO, so it could be a more complicated class. It doesn't have to just be a simple native type like this. But for this simple example, we're going to pass the response is going to be a string. So a key point to mention here is that when we go to the handler, so I mentioned that iRequest handler is implementing this interface, and we've got these generic types here as well. This is the request, and this is the response type. So this is how Mediator knows, if we go to the controller, when we're saying mediator.send, and we're sending this request type, that's how it knows which handler to call. So that's how it links, and that's how it knows how to delegate to which handler. So now we've got that. So if we just F5 and run this, so we're running the web API. If you're used to using Postman to send out test API requests, or VS Code has got an extension called REST Client. Rider has got very similar to REST Client, where you can, so REST Client in VS Code looks very similar. You can have an HTTP file, which you can say get or post or put or whatever, and you can specify a URL. So it's just another way of doing what you would do in Postman. So if I run this now, this is making a GET request to our endpoint. We can see we've got 200 response, and we've got our hello.NET Southwest from the from our handler. So that's kind of like Mediator just automatically wired that up. So I mentioned about behaviors before. So if we just go to back to the slides a sec. Imagine the caller here is our endpoint. So it's the thing that's calling Mediator. And then you've got your handler. So you've got your like request going in that we saw. So that was my request. And then you've got your response, which in our case was the string going out. Then, and obviously Mediator is mediating all this. You can create something called a behavior. So a behavior is a class, and it works very, very similar to like ASP.NET middleware. So if we just go back to the code and go to this behavior. If you've ever done anything with ASP.NET middleware, this will look very familiar. And the idea is that everything that happens before this, so like here, and we're just console.writeLine handling my request, so that'll resolve to my request. And then afterwards, we've got console.writeLine handled my request. And so if we go back to here, not this one, and then everything before the on next, the next call is on the way in, and everything after is on the way out. So you can see that everything in this function, and again, this is handle method, which will be called automatically. Everything inside this function has access to request. Everything after next has access to response. And you can edit this as part of the pipeline, so you can change what's in response. So it works, as I say, it works very similar to ASP.NET Core middleware, and so you can use it for things like logging or authorization, that kind of thing. So if we've already made this web request here, and we can see we've got the hello.NET Southwest. Because I already had this running, I already had this behavior. If we go to the actual web API output, then we can see we've got that log. So this console write line is here. Then because we've got this next here, it's calling the handler. So we've got this log from our handler, which we saw before, and then we've got the console write line, which happens afterwards on the way back. With behaviors, because you can have lots of different ones. You can have like quite a few different behaviors. You can create a pipeline. Then these do need, whilst handlers and your our handlers really don't need registering in startup in your IOC container, then the behavior does. So I can do this here. I've just with ASP.NET Core IOC, I'm just registering the iPipeline behavior. Now you can see that here I'm not specifying any generic types, so this will work for all requests, but you can specify request response here, and then that would happen just for a particular request. So it's quite configurable, and then you can just have a few of these in, and you can choose the order of which. So obviously these will be different behaviors, and you can choose the order that your behaviors will be called in the pipeline. So if you're in your behavior, if you're writing behavior that only does on the way in or only does on the way out, then there's a Mediator provides a bit of a helper just to save you doing await next. It's called a preprocessor or a post-processor, and this works the same way, where instead of iPipeline behavior, use iRequest preprocessor or iRequest post-processor, and then you don't need this wait next. So it'll be either on the way in or on the way out. So it just cleans up your code a little bit. And the last thing I wanted to mention is there's two. We've seen so far the request response way of doing things, which is like in here. So you can see like the caller is making a request via Mediator to one handler, and maybe some behaviors as well, but one handler, and you get a response back. The response back is optional. You don't have to have the response back. It could be a command where you might not get a response back if you're getting a query. So this is where CQRS comes in. But Mediator also supports something called notifications, where with a notification, this doesn't support behaviors. It doesn't support responses. It's literally you send a notification in, and Mediator can just dispatch that out to multiple handlers. So if we could quickly, oops, where's Ryder gone? So I've got a notification handler. I've got two. So these are two classes. The only difference is we've got 1 and 2 at the end here. We're logging out hello this from notification handler 1 and notification handler 2. We don't need to register anything else. We don't need to do anything else. Then in our controller endpoint, instead of calling send, we call publish instead. Instead of sending a request, we send a notification. And the notification looks very similar. This is the request. It looks very similar, except that we're implementing iNotification. And notice that because it's no response, it can't have a generic for a response type. And then back to our controller. So if we just comment this out and use this one, because this doesn't return anything, we're going to just get rid of like this here. And then just stop that and rerun. So that's the only change I've made, except for adding the notification handler. So it's kind of to data open close principle as well. So it really does help support a lot of different patterns. So if we go back to our request and make another request. Ooh, connection refused. That's interesting. The demo gods. Check again. 2001. Let's just try going to non-HTTP then, see if that works. I'm not sure why that's failing, but basically what that did in practice, in rehearsal, is it was a get which returned the 200 but didn't return any value because we're not returning anything. And then in our In our notification handler, it just console logged both of these. I'm not sure why I'm getting this error at the moment, but I'm probably out of time, so I don't really have time to try and work it out. This is the website with Mediator on. It's got a wiki, and a lot of the stuff I've just spoken about, it just goes in depth. It's got really good documentation. We can see that it supports like other IOC containers as well. Talks about request response, notifications. Something we're not spoken about is exception handling, but it's got concepts around that as well. So it's a really nice library, and it really helps enforce these patterns. So I hope that was useful. I think I'm just over time now, but thank you very much.